Welcome to Season 4 of Mysterion. We have a special guest with us again. It's Father Silviu back with us. And I want to clear something up. Last season, we had his mentor, Archbishop Alexander, on there. And I had mentioned that Archbishop's work, his theological work, had came into my hands through a questionable source. And I mentioned you. And I think some people were confused by me saying that. And I just want to say here and now that I stand by those words. Very questionable source.
I was sitting right there.
He was. You was.
So today on Mysterion, we're interviewing a questionable source.
A questionable source.
There we go.
Stick with us. Two friends,
Two pastors
two theologians,
pursuing spiritual life
by exploring the scriptures.
in conversation with the fathers. I'm Dr. Wes Arblaster,
And I'm Dr. Ethan Smith.
and we are
Mysterion.
All right, guys. So today, once again, we have a special guest with us, Father Silviu Bunta. He's joined us a few times so far in Mysterion, and it's always been wonderful to have him here to be able to ask him questions. And
Thank you for making me work again.
got to put you to work for a little
pleasure.
while. You know?
Trust me.
But yeah, one of the reasons why we really wanted to call you in is because we are going to be entering a season 4 here of Mysterion, and what that's going to involve, all season 4 is revolving around Lent. And so we thought having somebody to come in here who's clergy, has a role to play in leading people through Lent. It'd be good to ask you some questions about that. But before we do, we kind of want to talk about the season as a whole. So we've dedicated the first 5 weeks to preparing for Lent. So we're going to be talking about some of the disciplines, some of the themes, some of the focus, the history of Lent, so we kind of all have a sense of what's going on. And then if people choose to join us from that point, then we're going to walk through the season, a journey through the season of observing Lent together. But we wanted to have some idea before it started what it's about, so people can decide if they would like to do that with us. And then once Lent actually begins, then we're actually going to dive in to things a little bit differently. We're going to be kind of sitting at the feet of St. Isaac the Syrian, and going to be kind of having a conversation going through his ascetical homilies together. And we're going to be inviting local Mysterion members to join us in that conversation.
It'll be really conversational. We're going to talk about our struggles going through our disciplines through Lent. We're talking about the wisdom St. Isaac is giving to us, talking about scriptural echoes and resonances that can inform what we're doing. And I think it should be a good season.
Yeah. So it's kind of a 2-part season. There's sort of like season 4A, which is preparation for Lent, and then season 4B, which is observing Lent and learning from St. Isaac.
And really, for season 4B, we want some of you to travel with us. You might be like us from a tradition that doesn't always practice Lent. You know, we're having an Ash Wednesday service for the first time this year and challenging our congregation to adopt some spiritual disciplines. If that's you and you want people to travel with, even if only virtually, do that. Talk to us on the Facebook page. We want to go through together and support each other as we go through this season.
Yep. So without further ado, let's dive right in and start asking some basic questions about what is Lent, where did it come from, what's it all about, right? So,
Sure.
So our questionable
Very
source.
specific.
Well, you ask a more specific question, then you take it away.
Lent, go.
Okay, all I need is 2 minutes.
Okay. I've never known that to be true.
The compliments keep on coming.
They keep flowing from across
Yes,
the table.
who needs enemies when you got friends? Where do you want me to start?
So, just basically, what's Lent? What's it about? It's 40 days, not counting Sundays, correct? Before Easter, right? So
Yeah, in the Western tradition, yes.
In your tradition, is it different? I'm sorry.
It is different, yes.
Oh.
Well,
that's right.
chances are, the historical evidence, if I remember it correctly, the audience must know that they gave me no heads up on this conversation, right? Very little. It was a text from Wes, the nice one, right? And that text itself was 6 lines long. Well, I think we'll talk about Lent and other things. Okay. If I remember the historical evidence, it's very clear that already in the 1st century, they were fasting before Easter, right? Chances are it was a short fast, but it was one of the harsh kind of fasting. There's two ways of fasting, basically, both East and West. One is the harsh kind, which is to eat and drink nothing for a while. And not so harsh kind, which is to eat and drink, but only certain things. So you restrict yourself from certain foods. The tradition about what those foods were was, I think, pretty much the same till probably about 14th, 15th century, and then the West kept changing and changing. And today, the Catholic Church, you give up whatever you want to give up. The earlier practice was to give up on meat, on other animal products like eggs, cheese, milk. I know
no
cheese
problem
will
on
sound
the
good.
cheese.
I knew it. He doesn't like
don't
cheese.
know I hate cheese.
So California and Wisconsin seriously are still listening to this guy. Anyway, so you give up on cheese, animal products, alcohol completely. Alcohol is otherwise was permitted, but not during fasting, and oil. That's the bummer. So basically, you are limited to being kind of vegan. Mm-hmm. But without being able to have anything fried. Everything has to be baked or boiled. In other words, nothing worth eating, as the bishop would say, right? And that's the other way of fasting. Now, we know, I think, that already in the first century, they were fasting before Easter. They were fasting also on certain days of the week, such as, I think, Wednesdays and Fridays are mentioned by the Didache, which is a first century text, first century document. And they were fasting before Easter probably for 2 or 3 days without eating or drinking anything, not even water, right? So you don't eat, you don't drink anything. Basically from Friday, Holy Friday, what we call Holy Friday, to the Easter service, on Sunday. Then it grew from there, but it grew different ways in the East from the West. Indeed, the West, the idea is to keep 40 days, but the West calculates differently. So it calculates the 40 days all the way up against the Triduum, the 3 days, Holy Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter. And it doesn't count the Sundays. Mm-hmm. In the East, eventually, probably by the 6th, 7th century, what got together, this is a mix anyway, coming mostly from Palestine, from the way Palestinian Christians were observing, but not only. Holy Week doesn't count at all toward the 40 days. So Holy Week is special. It's also called the Bridegroom Week. Oh. And that's very significant because it tells you how Lent was understood earlier on. I'll get back to it. So Holy Week doesn't count at all. Lazarus Sunday, which is the Sunday before Holy Week, so the Sunday before Easter Sunday is the Sunday dedicated to the resurrection of Lazarus. The entrance into Jerusalem, the Lord's entrance into Jerusalem, and the Saturday before the Lazarus Saturday, the resurrection of Lazarus. Now, Lent is calculated 40 days back from that Friday, so 9 days before Easter. You go 40 days back. And that's why the beginning falls on a Monday in the East, but in the West, calculating back from the Triduum, it falls on a Wednesday.
After Fat Tuesday.
After Fat Tuesday, yes, or Mardi Gras, right, in French. Anyway, the purpose for those Fat Tuesdays was to consume all the animal products, all the fats, right? That's what animal products usually meant, in the house, so that you got rid of them. They wouldn't keep for 40 days. So you want to get rid of them before Lent begins. Mm-hmm. That's the idea.
So why are Christians doing this? Because I think the reason why I bring that up is because the exposure to fasting within, for example, more evangelical church traditions is it's a very individual thing, and it's usually related to maybe there's a certain cause or purpose. And where they get this from is from the Gospels, where we find that, Jesus says this particular illness or this particular demon can only be exercised through fasting and prayer. So it's very individualized and it's for a specific purpose or a specific personal spiritual discipline. But what we have here is the whole church doing it together, saying, and we start here and we stop here. Why are they doing that?
Oh my goodness. Even if you read the early church fathers, I think you find many different reasons. They talk about, of course, the spiritual benefit. because actually not eating physically is is nothing else but nudging the body to eat spiritually, the whole human being to eat spiritually. A proper understanding of fasting, I should say this first and foremost, works only if we don't have this dualism between body and soul. Right? We don't think of the body in any terms separately from the soul. Once you separate the two and you think and you start doing it only for bodily benefits, right? It does make you healthier, obviously. Right?
It's a form of dieting, right?
But it's a form of dieting.
Yes,
but
very
then
popular.
you're missing
Yes.
it. It's very popular, right? You're missing the point. So that split between body and soul aside, it has spiritual benefits. It really helps. It heightens. It concentrates the human being in the other dimension of the human being. Every single one of us has that dimension, right? Which is not to be fleshly. Again, we cannot be bodiless, but not to be fleshly, not to perceive everything through the body, look at the whole world through the body, touch the whole world through the body, but be more spiritual. The fathers talk about fasting as a form of mourning, right? We mourn what is going to happen, and then we rejoice what will eventually happen, which is the resurrection. Many, many reasons. But I think, if I remember correctly, the most common quote, when the father have to justify fasting, and they rarely have to do it, because everybody was doing it in the early centuries, right? So you read the book of Acts. I mean, several times they're being told they were fasting. So the apostles and their disciples, if you want, are caught fasting by the narrative many, many times, right? They are there, they are together. I think when they sent Barnabas out, they fast. It was a time of fasting. They fast. They rarely have to justify it, but they still had to explain some things. Every now and then they had to justify. They wrote books on fasting. There's a lot of literature on fasting. But they usually appeal to this one text, which is when the Lord himself was asked to justify why the disciples do not fast. Right?
Yes.
So the leaders say, we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast. Obviously, he himself was fasting. We know he himself fasted up to 40 days before he even started his mission. Why don't your disciples fast? And his answer pretty much comes down to this. The wedding attendees do not fast during the wedding, but when the bridegroom goes away, when they don't have the bridegroom, when the wedding feast is kind of over, and they wait for the bridegroom to come back, really, then they fast, and they will fast. So Christ is basically saying, don't worry, they will fast. But the bridegroom is still here. The bridegroom will go away. I think that's the ultimate explanation for why we fast. We're supposed to have this sense that we're waiting for the bridegroom. We're waiting for a wedding, that our wedding is not here yet, right? In other words, it's a sense of longing for Christ. I mentioned at the beginning that in the Eastern tradition, the whole week is called the Bridegroom week. The services are called bridegroom services, and the image of the bridegroom, Christ as the bridegroom, is the most common one during that week, the Holy Week, on the way to Easter. We call it Pascha. That's because he's being prepared. And the bridegroom prepares himself precisely by being bitten, being spat on, being broken, being betrayed, being crushed, and eventually dying. This is how the bridegroom looks like. This is the preparation for the feast. This is how God offers himself to us, right? As being beaten down. That's the victory, is actually being beaten down to nothing and dying, being reduced to death. And we call actually the tomb the bridal chamber. So that's the image that I find the most dominant. To give you like a straightforward answer, the most dominant image that I find already in the earlier centuries for why should Christian fast. Because they have to have a sense that they're preparing for a wedding. The bridegroom is getting ready during Lent, and he's getting ready by being torn apart.
So it kind of connects with what I'm thinking about is the last episode in season 3 when we were talking about Mary and Jesus, and we're tying together the wedding feast in Cana with the cross and Mary before the cross. And we said, in some sense, that wedding in Cana is a prefiguration of a kind of wedding that's happening on the cross. And the way that you're talking, I've never heard that before, that the tomb of Christ is called the bridal chamber, which is kind of the consummation of, isn't it, of this wedding, right?
Wedding, yes.
And so the lack that Christ experienced, the deprivation, is a preparation for this, and Christians are entering into that as well.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's a profound kind of image of the feast. We're approaching a feast, right? That Paschal feast, right? And we do that by experiencing some kind of lack, and that's participation in the life of Christ in that way.
One of the things we've talked about, I think we try to introduce to some of our evangelical audience, is how all the talk in the Gospels about the wedding feast and the bridegroom, right? This is very central, right? This is just not just metaphor, but union with Christ, marriage with God in Christ is at the heart of these things. And this idea, not only that Christ is being prepared, and that it's the bridal chamber is the tomb, but that in Lent we too fast, right? We're attempting to enter into that. So it's not just something that illuminates those ideas or that history back there, but in Lent, through these practices, we're actually being invited to participate into this, right?
Right.
And then I think about the significance of 40 and how that just sort of echoes throughout the scriptures, right? Christ fasted for 40 days, 40 nights. There's the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. There's Moses on the top of the mountain for 40 days, which is, the rabbis, if I'm right, they made a big deal of that. Like, what did he eat up there? There's no food on the top of mountains in that part of the world.
Not physical.
Not physical. So like you were saying about fasting is so you're more attuned to the other dimension where Christ as God's glory is shining. And so, we're not unlike Moses on the top of the mountain, or at least we're trying to approach. So I was just thinking, like, if you want, we could explore so many different biblical images of this issue of the 40 and the fasting and the tempting and that movement into union or feeding on the very presence of God.
So let's think about this for a second, though, because when I first started having conversations with some folks about this, one of the immediate responses is, this is supposed to have spiritual benefit in terms of leading me towards Christ, but as soon as I enter into it, I become a less nice, kind, gentle, understanding person. So when you
don't have far to fall,
right? When I'm deprived of food, I tend to become more. How do I say it? The opposite of what Jesus looks like. So maybe we could talk for a second about that, because I think that's important. Right. Because some of us then look at it and say, "Well, this is not cracked up." It's sold to us as something that's supposed to be form us spiritually, but actually, it's, if anything, it's having the opposite effect, because we equate immediate sort of, I don't know how to say it, immediate formation, like all of a sudden I'm just going to become more loving or more kind, with spiritual growth, right? But those aren't the same thing, are they? I don't want to lead you. I guess what I want to say is, what would you say to folks who say, I just get more cranky when I do this? So.
Well, it can be done for different reasons, right? And I'm not trying to say that some reasons are completely bad, but some reasons are better than others. There is faith, and there is faith, and there is faith, and there is faith. And we can believe, but we can still be helped in our unbelief, like, as someone told the Lord. Faith can be done in so many different levels, in so many different ways. One is in this way, which generally doesn't work. It didn't work for Paul. To put it in Paul's terms, I think we can summarize St. Paul's theology to the following: that he's been trying to be righteous his whole life. It didn't get him in the right place, right? But he tried very hard to be righteous because he thought righteousness is a program. And then he discovered, and this was the great discovery on the way to Damascus, that righteousness is a person. And righteousness is not something you do. Righteousness is something that's given to you in this person that you can become. But what it takes for you to become that righteousness, that person, is for you to die. And it's a terrible thing to die. I think this came up in one of our previous conversations. To die to yourself. Short of that death to yourself, we practice faith as that righteousness, as a program, as commandments, as a set of rules, practices, and behaviors, right? And doctrines, right? It doesn't work. And we know the earliest texts we have in the New Testament are St. Paul's letters. And the earliest texts we have as Christians are telling us, among many other things, but I think this is a central thing, that righteousness does not exist. Nobody can obey the law. Mm. So when we try to obey the law and we don't understand that it has been obeyed and it is presented to us as already obeyed in a person, we will fail. St. Paul failed. Many others have tried in the meantime, have failed. And it can lead to terrible damages. And that's one example, I think, of such damages. With Paul, it led to the damage of killing his own brothers and sisters, right?
Yeah.
All for the sake of being righteous. He didn't set up his earlier life, pre-conversion life, if you want to be an evil person. He studied hard and he really tried to be a righteous person. It never works. We cannot be righteous. I think that's one of the premises of St. Paul's asceticism, if you want, right? It's like, first thing he would tell us, you can't be righteous. Nobody can be righteous. God is righteous. Righteousness is a person, and you can acquire him, and in him you'll acquire your righteousness. And that's an entirely different way of setting about even fasting or anything else, so that it's not done with resentment. It has to be done with longing. Right? And it has to be done with this death of the self, and that goes to precisely what you said, which is spot on. I want benefits, and they're not going to come, at least, or they won't come precisely in the way in which I want them to be. Mm. And I'll be resentful. I'll be even I'll hate, and I'll be snappy, and instead of fasting having the exact opposite effect on me.
In some ways, the way that, at least, when I, for example, we spent some time with Evagrius. Mm-hmm. These things seem to me, like Evagrius seems to be saying, a lot of this is like a mirror. And as you begin to practice it, you begin to see who you really are. Yes. Like those places where, well, I thought I was kinder than that. I thought I was more patient than that. And when we begin to fast and we realize, wait a minute, I'm not really even becoming necessarily more righteous, right? It begins to show us the truth about ourselves in that way, right?
Yes. Which can be unpleasant and difficult.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Coming face to face with yourself is it's a route towards transformation, but it's a very, very difficult one, right? And I think some of our defenses can come down with these things, and there you are. And I would say it's good to have support. Just putting this out there before anybody just sort of jumps, 2 feet in to do this. You've never done this before. Make sure there's some support. You have people you can lean on, some spiritual guidance.
But doesn't that connect somewhat too with what you were saying, Father Silviu, about longing? I mean, because you have this mirror, and you begin to see yourself for who you really are. Like, for example, I don't think my life is that determined by food. I mean, but that's because whenever I want, I go eat something. And you get what I'm trying to say. And then as soon as we say, okay, we're not going to do that anymore, or we're not going to do it in that way, or these things I'm going to be are withheld. And I begin to realize how bound up I am with that. Then again, it can be defeating. It can feel that way. But if you realize that it's a season of longing, you're not just longing for Christ to come at the end, but you start to long for Christ to be revealed in you, because there's a sense in which I see who I really am. Does that make sense what I'm saying there?
That makes perfect sense. St. Paul, I think, uses the imagery of mirroring twice, right? Once is in 2 Corinthians 3. Both times, I think it's in the Corinthians correspondence. it's usually translated, this has to do with Moses going up on Sinai, and us, right, perceiving as in a mirror, that's how the English translation goes, the image, right, which should be capitalized, it's Christ. But actually the verb there doesn't mean perceiving as in a mirror, but rather mirroring Christ. Mm-hmm. And then also he says another thing, that in order truly to have faith means to see that Christ is in ourselves. But what that requires, and this is throughout, especially in 2 Corinthians, but throughout the Corinthian correspondence, is precisely for me to be reduced to nothing, to face myself as I am. Mm. Right? The one who cannot fast properly, right? The one who's so dependent on food, the one who can only subsist, live on to see the next day if he kills something. Because we feed on death, right? We eat organic matter, and everything we eat, we kill, right? It dies in our stomachs, right? Yeah. Probably the greatest killing machine is the human stomach, right? Whether it's meat, and even if it's not meat, it's vegetables. That's a living thing, and we feed on that. To have a proper relationship, even with our own food, with among other things, but everything else, uncovers this truth for us that we are nothing. And in understanding that I myself am nothing, only in that I can see Christ as everything. And only in that I can see Christ as everything in me. And that's not joined by any sense of pride, because it happens precisely as I realize I am nothing. Mm. Right? The image of Christ in me is clarified as the image of me in me collapses. Right? It kind of falls apart in all the nothingness that I am. There's no other way. There is no other way. There is no other way to see Christ, but through my nothingness, to see Christ in me, to mirror in me the image, the prototype of everything, from glory, to never-ending glory, to greater and greater glory. It's a terrible thing, like Ethan said. It's a terrible thing. That it's not an exercise. It's actually an existential crisis.
So let's talk about that for 1 second. I don't mean to keep talking. Do you have a particular question or no?
I'm going to become less and let you talk more.
So let me say this. It seems
he's
to me
waiting for his moment, right? I don't like him when he's all quiet.
Just to kind of, I honestly feel like what you're saying is really profound. But like, so people often say, I want to engage in Lent, or I want to practice Lent, and in the back of our minds, we're thinking, I'm going to better myself through this in some way, right? But what you are talking about is kind of, it's a very paradoxical thing, because we are seeking, we're seeking holiness, we're seeking Christ, but that's precisely through, coming face to face with the fact that I'm maybe can't get better on my own or from myself. And so there is no, in some ways, is Lent the opposite of trying to better yourself? I don't know. I guess I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. And
yes,
I think it's an important question,
It is. Yeah. See, and I think that's where the way the Lent is set up in the East, in the liturgical setting of Lent, right, goes there. Because, I mentioned the Holy Week and then the 40 days, right, which we count continuously. Without taking the Sundays out. But we have preparatory weeks, what we call preparatory weeks. There are 3 formal preparatory weeks, but there is a fourth one, preparatory Sundays properly. So 4 weeks before Lent even begins, we have what we call the Sunday of Zacchaeus, where we read the gospel on Zacchaeus. Mm. What's the gospel about? Someone who's willing to become ridiculous. If you see a grown-up person climbing a tree, there's nothing more pitiful than that. Well, probably, okay, the only thing that beats it, if you see a grown-up person trying to ride a donkey's fall, right? That's the most pitiful image, right? So Christ beat Zacchaeus at that, at being pitiful, at being humble. But it's this desire. All I want is to get a peek at him. I want to see Christ. Then the following Sunday is the Sunday of the publican and the Pharisee, where we read the gospel on the publican and the Pharisee. Anyway, and then the following Sunday is Sunday of judgment, and then the Sunday of forgiveness. So these are the preparatory Sundays. So then we read Matthew 25, and then we read, I think it's Matthew 6, immediately after Our Father, that if you want to be forgiven, you have to forgive. And anyway, so these are the preparatory Sundays. They set up the tone, if you want, for the whole Lent. This is what Lent is about. My desire to catch a glimpse at Him. And it's a good desire. But the next Sunday already sets things in place even further, because He tells you the gospel of the publican and the Pharisee, that the only way to draw close is to look at yourself as nothing, right? I am the one who stands in the way of Christ, nothing else. Nothing else around me stands in the way of Christ the way I stand in the way of Christ. My desires, my goals, right? And I'm not advocating for people just giving up on whatever they want to do in life, but for getting a different relation to what they want to do in life, right? That's what it is. It's not easy. If it cannot be done, that's fine. Fasting for any purpose, it's still wonderful. It's important, like I think you pointed out, not to do it, and Ethan too, not to do it on your own, whichever way you want to do it. Do it with someone else. Collectively is better. That's why I don't like the Western practice of everybody giving up whatever they want for Lent. What is the sense of church, right? So doing it together, and doing it in such sense that we really function like organs of the same body, so that we only together we're being built into one body, relying on each other and carrying each other through. Because it's not easy. You really give out on the yummiest stuff. The only things worth eating, as the bishop puts it, Archbishop Alexander. It's like the only things worth eating. Right?
So some of our listeners probably have never really seriously tried fasting. So those warnings are important, because precisely this idea, it's to demonstrate to us our weakness. It's not an act of moral or spiritual heroism.
Right.
So the idea isn't to simply go abuse your body out of nowhere in this fit of zealotry to demonstrate something. That one, that spiritually that's running in the opposite direction perhaps than we should go. And two, I mean, you can seriously hurt yourself doing that. And so I just wanted to be careful with that. A couple of things I was thinking of, you talked about the Pharisee and the publican, and this, and you're sewing that together with Paul's theology, and like where he's the problem, right? I no longer live, Christ lives in me. Not having a righteousness of my own, but his. It reminded the publican, most of our translations, his prayer to remind our listeners is, in most of our Bible it says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. But really, he says, as you've pointed out before, the sinner, right? This attitude of without you, I'm nothing. And that's precisely that kind of humility brings him into the presence of the Lord. It says he's justified. And then,
and the verb there actually means he is made righteous.
Made righteous, right.
Literally, right? He's not more justified, he's made righteous.
And then when we do, I don't want to think this whole episode about fasting, but one of the things fasting does is it brings on this crisis, right? It demonstrates this weakness to us. It's the opposite of a heroism or achieving something. And then even our struggle in the fast, our failing in the fast, our being cranky in the fast, what it can do is remove us from some sense that this is just some idea of moral progression. It's rather coming face to face with the Lord in our weakness, our nothingness, as you say. And, I want to go back to 2 Corinthians. I mean, you guys both know my love of 2 Corinthians, where, at the beginning where Paul talks about how he and his companions, they had the sentence of death written in their souls. And he says, this was done so that we would trust in the God who raises the dead. I think we just blow over that. Again, to go back to your point, Paul thinks the thing between him and Christ is him.
Yes.
And the less Paul there is, the more Christ is all in all in him. And so he says, we're kind of all addicts to our own power, our own ambitions. and he interprets the hardships of this world, right, as sort of loosening his grip on that.
Yeah.
It seems to me like when we want to do asceticism well, so then you get to chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, and he talks about, Christ's power manifest in weakness. And life is doing that to us, and it will do this to us. But I think when we engage voluntarily in Lent, we're kind of like setting ourselves up for that, right? We're kind of what this world will eventually do to us and demonstrate to us our nothingness, and then Christ becomes all. We're freely letting some of that happen in hopes to come face to face with Christ in that weakness. And I want to make that clear to our listeners, just because I think that's a better mindset going into this. And,
So to give some examples, for example, like if we're starting to feel hungry or more tired, or I really want that, and you have that kind of sense going on there, we are starting to feel the limits of who we are, right? And it's precisely in feeling those limits we begin to be exposed to our weakness, right? There's weakness there. There's dependency. There's like all of these things. And when we experience that and we recognize it as that, what do we do with that, right? Mm-hmm. So how does that, in some sense, show us Christ?
Because that's precisely where he is. See, one of the things. So talking about 2 Corinthians, right? Paul, I think at least once, uses a very powerful word which is never translated literally, which means deadness or rottenness, the rottenness condition of being human. But the great mystery, if you read 2 Corinthians very carefully, the great mystery of all that, this goes to your question, I think, is that's precisely where Christ is hidden. That's why it triumphs, right? The epistle into his vision, and actually into him being broken under all this weight and getting the ultimate answer. Don't you understand? That's precisely where I am with you. Right? In your deadness, in your rottenness. This is why the bridegroom prepares himself in the tomb. He prepares himself for me, who I am a simple human, by becoming all human, completely human. And the ultimate definition of me, the ultimate completion of the human being. And this is the verb that is translated many times in the New Testament, but unfortunately even in Orthodox services wrongly, about death, is completion. We're not fully completed until we die. St. Ignatius put it straightforwardly, I will die and then I will be human. Mm-hmm. This is it's only the experience of death that reduces me to what it means to be human, that shows me precisely what it means to be human, which is nothing. Christ becomes that nothing. I will find him in that nothingness, right? In my failures, in my... So it's not, indeed, like Ethan said, this is not a program of success. It's actually a program of failing. If we don't fail in the sense that we turn out to be incapable of holding the whole fast, we will fail in the sense that we'll realize what we are, like you put it. How dependent I am on this food. How pitiful I am.
So maybe the kind of posture we could recommend to folks is, let's say I feel that weakness, that lack, that limit, and I realize that, man, I really want to go eat some McDonald's,
Yeah.
And I say, Lord, have mercy on me, or Lord, help me. Yeah. Like that, when you say Christ is going to show up in that weakness, it's a sense in which our own self is turning more towards Christ and realizing that we can't do this on our own, right?
Yes. Well,
and we begin to call on him, right?
When you get impatient in a fast, right, and you say, wow, it just doesn't take much for me to lose my patience with those who I love. And you recognize that point Father Silviu, I think, opened up with is righteousness is a person, Jesus Christ, right? So this is not something I can achieve. Look how quickly I am moved to impatience.
Right.
And so I'm not simply, oh gosh, I'm dependent on food, but my goodness, my righteousness could only be Christ.
Yes.
And that he appears in that way.
Yes.
You know?
Yes, in my hangriness, right?
In my hangriness, yes.
Yes, he appears in this failure. It's yes. See, this is why he says on the cross at the very last moment, the very last words, "It is completed." Not finished in the sense that I've done my job, but I have completed what it means to be human. Now I feel even the ultimate moment of humanity, death, with myself. I've completed the human being in my death. And all these, even the failure, even that failure when you really have to have a McDonald's, right? If done properly, is still an experience of Christ. Right? It's extraordinary once you gain a certain spiritual sensitivity to how our lives run. You realize that there's no running away from Him. I have Him in moments, even in the moments when I think I'm losing Him. The sense of losing Him is still an experience of Christ, right? He's filled even the sense of being lost, the sense of being abandoned, the sense of having nothing to hold on to. He's filled that with Himself, right? In the garden, we know. So He's taken all our experiences and He filled all of them with Himself. And now I cannot not have Him. Fasting helps to sharpen our spiritual senses to realize this. But paradoxically enough, even when we fail at it, we are still having an experience of Christ.
Yeah.
It's very difficult it's difficult to get rid of Him. He's filled everything with Himself.
So with folks who might be seriously considering entering into this fast and observing the fast, there's the sort of, you said, like the fasting from animal products. There's the fasting from oil, the fasting from alcohol, right? And there's a sort of a general, this is what we do. But there's also a sense where some people may fast more than that, and some people may fast less than that. And there's some spiritual discernment that's required for each person to consider, what is it that I can do, or what should I do? What kind of questions do you think people should ask of themselves as they kind of consider that? Like, let's say we have this, my understanding is there's kind of a general bar, and then some people are going to go above and some people are not going to do that. And what are good questions for people to ask as they consider how far they might observe a fast?
Well, a good point to begin, to my knowledge, I think the general answer, the general advice you can get from the fathers or tradition overall on this is not to do it alone, not to do it by yourself on your own, right, desires and plans, but always talk to someone else. This is why in this, for example, the institution, this is a huge institution, the institution of eldership, of the spiritual elder, spiritual mother, spiritual father. This is a person who's done those things, right, has gone through all the motions. And you don't do as a rule in the East, and it's a pretty strong rule, if you want, you don't do anything without consulting your spiritual elder, your elder. This has nothing to do with authority. It has everything to do with these practical reasons, like Evagrius puts it, right? Yeah. Evagrius, if anything, is very practical, right? Yeah. That's why he wrote a book which is called Practical. Practical not as in, pragmatic, but practical as in practice, right? Someone who's practiced all these things. The first thing I like to point out is, if you go at it alone and you find yourself in uncharted territories, talk to someone, right? Ask others. It's best to do it as a community. After all, this is first and foremost the experience of church, the experience of community. this sense of that where I see myself, I understand myself as an organ in a body, somebody else's body, in which everybody else in my community is an organ. Also, I don't go at it alone as much as possible. And again, when you're on uncharted waters, talk, ask. It can be very complex, right? Like you two pointed out, right? What do I do now? I really want a McDonald's, or what do I do now?
I was reading.
I've had my McDonald's already, right? Now I feel bad about it.
I was reading a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about some. There was a congregation. It was a young, actually Orthodox congregation, and a lot of them were converts from evangelicalism. And they said, we're going to do this. We're going to do it right. And they fasted from all food for about 4 or 5 days. And people started passing out like in the aisles because the thought was, we're going to do it right. And there wasn't any discernment. There wasn't any conversation. And it ended up being that it was unhealthy for them that way. So that's just a kind of funny example.
Physically okay. But that in itself is a lesson, right?
It is a lesson, right? Exactly.
And the thing is, that lesson has been had so many times before in the history of the church, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
That's why the advice is go talk to someone.
Right.
People have gone through that. Don't worry about it. They can tell you, don't do it. Just don't do it.
And this is actually a personal conversation too between me and my wife, because my wife has that I don't know, it's like hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia. I don't remember the one, but there's hypo. But if there's not she doesn't get the blood sugar right, that it can really it can really mess with her thought processes and things like that. So individual discernment regarding the limits of our own bodies and that all that's
medical conditions.
Yes.
Medical conditions.
Yes.
And there's many. If you read the, for example, early monastic literature, like the literature coming out of the Egyptian desert, right, from where Evagrius comes, they will tell you that there are things that are greater than fasting in terms of what I should be focused on. So, for example, the receiving of travelers, of strangers, right? If someone visits you and they're traveling and they're hungry, you break all fasting. Actually, you keep all fasting by feeding them well and by cooking well. Because otherwise, we fall precisely into the thing we want to avoid, which is the New Testament called it Pharisaism, right? Which probably not a lot of Pharisees were doing themselves, but anyway. But it's a tendency, it's a common human tendency to reduce faith, which is much greater than anything, than any set of rules and, as I said, behaviors and practices and doctrines, to reduce it to a system, to a set of things to do. And so, yes, that's...
Before we end, we were going to spend a few moments, right, talking about this story and seeing if it can illuminate some things. Do you think we got time for that?
I don't know. I don't know if we have time for that.
Oh my goodness! I've talked a lot. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right.
No, that's fine. We could just...
We could briefly read it, and then we could have some final thoughts, or something like that, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah?
So this is from the Apathogmata, was the stories of the Desert Fathers. And we'll be coming back to this if you join us for Season 4. It's why we have the season called All Flame, And it goes like this. Abba Joseph came to Abba Lot, and Abba there means father, and said to him, Father, according to my strength, I keep a moderate rule of prayer and fasting, quiet and meditation. And as far as I can control my imagination, what more must I do? And the old man rose and held his hand towards the sky, so that his fingers became like flames of fire. And he said, If you will, you shall become all flame. End of story.
So we decided to kind of use this as a theme to explore as we go into season of Lent. And there's the image of fire here, the experience of the flame, is connected in the story to what the original question is: I fast and I pray, and what more must I do? How would you respond to just initial thoughts to this story?
I think actually the answer, if you will, you can become all flame, is someone also a little bit ironic, because I think the younger Avam has somewhat of a, what should I say, a beginner's attitude, that I want to do this, I'm doing this, which came up in our conversation. I've done all of these things. What else do I have to do? Which is also the attitude we find in the Gospels with a young rich person. I've kept all the commandments. Right. This is it. And then Christ tells him, "Oh, you just have to be perfect. Don't worry about it. You just." Right? But otherwise, you're on the right path. There's a little bit of irony here too, because the end of it all is again precisely the death of me. It's not about what I want. It's about what Christ will do to me. The elder didn't set himself on fire. The fire is Christ. And the way he arrived there, paradoxically enough, is not by that way, not by that road. I want to do this. I want to be. So, in other words, fire, being flame, is precisely the thing we cannot desire to be, and we cannot make ourselves be. We become the flame the exact opposite way, when we desire nothing. Right? When our eyes are only on Christ, when we don't want to beat ourselves up, to turn ourselves into something, into heroes, like you said, heroes of ascetical achievements. But when we have that existential crisis that turns me into nothing, Christ will build me up. Christ will raise me. He is the fire. He is everything. All of these stories, and it's not the only story, right? In the East has this extraordinary fascination with the Transfiguration, when Christ shows himself for what he actually is. And that's because that's the story of every holy person. And this is the story of this holy person. He is in front of the younger father in the form of Christ, in the fire of Christ. It's not his own fire. Mm-hmm. The human being has no fire whatsoever. The human being amounts to a smaller bag of bones, right? And probably a handful of dust. That's what we amount to. Christ is everything. Christ set him on fire. And he set him on fire in this way which is not the way of the young rabbi. I've done this, and then tell me more. What can I do?
Yes.
Right? You can do and accomplish precisely nothing. Christ, though, can light you on fire. Acquire him. Acquire Christ. Acquire the Holy Spirit.
It reminds me of Romans 12:1, when he says, "Commit your bodies as a living sacrifice." It's just be the dead animal, right? Just be that. Yes. Commit your body, and be burned up.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
But that's the fire. That's the spirit. That's the spirit
fire
of Christ. Yeah.
That's life. So, like in the Gospel of John, there is no other way for you to live unless you die. Right. So the wheat, right, the grain of it must die in order to live. Right. There's no other way. You want to follow me, right? You will lose your lives, and then unless you lose your lives, you will not live. This is the great mystery. It's the death of the self. That's the great mystery. And once we die to ourselves and we no longer live, but Christ lives in us, oh my goodness, we're on fire. But that's Christ. It's Christ's fire. So the story has just the proper amount of irony and very subtle lessons in it to point out this ultimate truth, that we're nothing and Christ is everything. And you'll see it's common, right, in many descriptions of the saints, if you read this literature for the rest of the season, for saints to be on fire, to be aflamed, to be luminous, right? This is how they're usually described. But it's the fire of the Transfiguration. Right? It's the fire of Christ. It is Christ.
All right. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you again.
Oh,
it's always good to have you.
You made me work again.
That's why I said it was good to have you here. I got to watch you work.
It's good for you.
You used to make me write papers for you and laugh at me as I was toiling over them. So now,
yes, that was indeed satisfying.
Well, guys, thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Bye.